A quiet evening turns into a life-changing event for Elijah Carter, a black man who sees an elderly woman collapsed in an alley. His instinct? To help. But the world around him misjudges his actions. Accusations fly, fueled by bias and misinformation, and his life spirals into chaos. What really happened that night? What secrets will the security footage reveal? And how does a man rebuild his life after being vilified by those he's dedicated to protecting? This is more than just a story, it's a journey through misunderstanding, redemption, and the power of empathy to change lives. Stick around to uncover the twists and turns of this gripping tale. And if you believe stories like this deserve to be told, hit that subscribe button and join our community of thoughtful viewers. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Comment below as the story unfolds. What would you have done in Elijah's shoes? Don't forget to turn on notifications so you never miss an inspiring story. Now, let's dive in and see how one man's courage sparks a movement. The soft glow of the setting sun painted the city streets in hues of gold and amber. Elijah Carter, 33, walked briskly through the neighborhood, his mind on the care package tucked under his arm. His sister Latoya had asked him to deliver it to a friend who had recently fallen on hard times. It wasn't out of character for Elijah. To help kindness was something he had been raised on. He paused for a moment, glancing at the worn facades of the buildings around him. This wasn't his usual route home, but it wasn't unfamiliar. As a police officer, Elijah had spent years patrolling neighborhoods like this, getting to know the people and their struggles. It was a far cry from the precinct's glossy mission statements. He thought about the past week at work, long hours, difficult calls, and an uneasy tension among some of his colleagues. Elijah, one of only a few black officers in his department, often felt the weight of representation. There were moments when he wondered if he was making a real difference, or if he was simply a figure for optics. Shaking off the thought, he adjusted his jacket and kept walking. The street was unusually quiet, save for the occasional hum of passing cars and the faint laughter of children in the distance. Elijah's eyes scanned the area, instinctively, a habit ingrained after years on the force. That's when he saw her. An elderly woman lay crumpled on the sidewalk near a dimly lit alley. Her frail body was partially obscured by the shadows, but her disheveled appearance was clear. Elijah's heart sank. "Ma'am," he called out, his voice steady but filled with concern. She didn't respond. He quickened his pace, dropping to one knee beside her. Up close, she looked even worse. Her thin face was pale, her clothes tattered, and her breathing shallow. Elijah gently touched her shoulder. "Ma'am, can you hear me?" A faint groan escaped her lips, but her eyes remained closed. Elijah reached for his phone, dialing 911. As he waited for the dispatcher to answer, Elijah noticed movement out of the corner of his eye. A small group of people had gathered across the street, their murmurs rising. A young man held up his phone, recording. "Yo, what's going on over there?" someone asked. "Looks like he's messing with that old lady," another voice replied, dripping with suspicion. Elijah's jaw tightened. He raised his hand slightly, trying to appear non-threatening despite the absurdity of the situation. "She needs help," he said loudly. "Can someone call an ambulance?" Instead of stepping forward, the crowd edged closer, their phones out. "Man, I bet he's robbing her," one woman whispered, her words cutting through the air like a knife. Elijah shook his head, disbelief washing over him. He didn't have time to argue. The woman stirred, her lips parting to mumble something incoherent. Elijah leaned closer, trying to make sense of her words. Behind him, the crowd's whispers turned into outright accusations. "Hey, what's he doing now? Looks like he's going through her stuff. I saw him take something from her bag," another voice chimed in. Elijah turned to face them, his frustration evident. "I'm trying to help her. She needs medical attention." But his words fell on deaf ears. The group had already decided what they believed. The woman coughed weakly, and Elijah returned his attention to her. He loosened the scarf around her neck, hoping to ease her breathing. The act only fueled the crowd's suspicions. "That's assault," a man shouted, pointing. The flashing blue lights of a police cruiser illuminated the street, the sirens cutting through the rising tension. Two officers stepped out, their expressions a mix of curiosity and apprehension. "Step away from the woman," one officer commanded, his hand resting on his holster. Elijah complied, raising his hands. "I'm an officer," he said, pulling out his badge and holding it up. The officers exchanged a glance, but didn't lower their guard. "We'll need you to back up and explain what's going on," the lead officer said firmly. Elijah took a step back, his hands still visible. "I found her like this. She was lying here unconscious. I called for help." The officers turned their attention to the crowd. "Did anyone see what happened?" "Yeah," one man said confidently. "He was all over her. Looked like he was robbing her, or worse." Elijah's chest tightened. "That's not true." The woman was loaded onto a stretcher and into an ambulance, her fragile condition keeping her from clarifying the situation. Meanwhile, Elijah found himself handcuffed, his badge forgotten in the chaos. "You're making a mistake," he told the officers, his voice calm but firm. "Then we'll clear it up at the station," one officer replied, avoiding his gaze. The crowd jeered as Elijah was led to the patrol car. The young man with the phone smirked, still recording. "Gonna be all over the gram tonight," he muttered. As the car pulled away, Elijah stared out the window, a mix of anger and disbelief coursing through him. He had always believed in the justice system, but tonight it felt like it had turned its back on him. By the time Elijah was released from custody hours later, the damage had already been done. Videos of the incident flooded social media, accompanied by inflammatory captions. "Officer or predator? Man caught assaulting elderly woman. Police protect their own, when will it stop?" Elijah scrolled through the posts in disbelief, his face pale. The comments were worse. "Typical. Lock him up. This is why we can't trust cops." Latoya burst into his apartment, her eyes blazing. "What the hell happened, Elijah?" "I was trying to help her," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "But no one cared. They just assumed." The days that followed were a blur of phone calls, accusations, and uncertainty. Elijah's department placed him on administrative leave, pending an investigation. The captain, a stern but fair man named Monroe, assured him it was standard procedure. "We'll get to the bottom of this," Monroe said. But his tone lacked conviction. Elijah's family rallied around him, but the strain was evident. His mother refused to leave her house, afraid of the backlash. Latoya, ever the fighter, began compiling evidence to clear his name. "Someone out there knows the truth," she said one evening, pacing the living room. "We just have to find them." Elijah nodded, though his hope was fading. Latoya's determination led her to the local businesses near the scene. She spent hours visiting shops, pleading for access to their security footage. Most were reluctant, citing policies or fear of getting involved. Finally, a convenience store owner named Mr. Bennett agreed to help. "I don't know what's on it," he said, handing over the footage, "but I hope it clears things up." Latoya watched the video with bated breath. It showed Elijah arriving at the scene, checking on the woman, and calling for help. There was no sign of wrongdoing. She raced home, bursting through the door. "We have it," she exclaimed, holding up a USB drive. The footage was released to a trusted journalist, who published an article titled "The Truth About Officer Carter." The accompanying video painted a starkly different picture from the viral clips. The tide began to shift. Support poured in from unexpected places, with hashtags like "Justice for Elijah" trending online. But not everyone was convinced. "He still shouldn't have touched her," one comment read. "Why didn't he wait for paramedics?" Elijah knew the fight wasn't over, but for the first time in weeks, he felt a glimmer of hope. The following days blurred together for Elijah. Although the footage began to circulate, proving his innocence to some, it was far from a complete exoneration. Doubt and mistrust lingered like a dark cloud. He sat alone one evening, scrolling through his phone. Messages of support were interspersed with hateful comments. "So what? Doesn't change what people saw. Bet the footage was edited. Can't trust the system to police itself." Latoya found him in the kitchen, his phone glowing in the dim light. She snatched it from his hands. "You can't keep reading this stuff, Elijah. It's toxic." "It's reality," he replied, his voice heavy. "Doesn't matter what the footage shows. People already decided I'm guilty." Latoya pulled up a chair beside him. "It's not about convincing everyone. It's about standing your ground and letting the truth speak for itself. You're stronger than this." Elijah wanted to believe her, but the weight of it all felt insurmountable. Maggie Tillman, the elderly woman Elijah had tried to help, remained hospitalized. Her fragile health kept her from making a statement, leaving the public to speculate. LaToya visited the hospital, hoping to speak with her. A nurse hesitated at first, but eventually led her to Maggie's room. The frail woman lay against a stack of pillows, her skin pale, but her eyes alert. "Maggie, my name is LaToya Carter. I'm here because of my brother, Elijah. He's the officer who helped you that night." Maggie's brow furrowed. "Help me," she murmured, her voice weak. "Yes," LaToya said gently. "But people are saying terrible things about him, things that aren't true. He needs your help to clear his name." Maggie's gaze softened. "I don't remember much," she admitted. "But I know I was scared. Then he was there. He wasn't trying to hurt me." Her words, though limited, were enough for LaToya to feel a glimmer of hope. News outlets seized on the new developments, further inflaming public opinion. Some praised Elijah as a hero, while others accused him of manipulating the narrative. One morning, Elijah woke to a barrage of notifications. A popular pundit had discussed his case on a national morning show. Officer Carter's situation is a perfect example of why we need to slow down and seek the facts before jumping to conclusions, the host argued. But her co-host pushed back. "Sure, but isn't it fair to ask why he even got involved? Sometimes, doing nothing is the safest choice." Elijah threw his phone onto the couch, frustration boiling over. "Doing nothing," he muttered. "How is that the answer?" LaToya placed a hand on his shoulder. "People will say whatever gets them attention. Don't let it shake you." As the controversy swirled, the neighborhood where the incident occurred became a focal point. Residents began sharing their perspectives, some defending Elijah and others fueling the accusations. "He's always been a good guy," said Mrs. Randall, a retired teacher who lived nearby. "Elijah used to patrol here all the time. He knows us. He cares." But another resident, Mr. Jenkins, was less forgiving. "I don't trust any cops, no matter what they say. They protect their own, not us." LaToya took it upon herself to speak at a community meeting, addressing the divide head-on. "My brother isn't perfect," she said, her voice steady. "But he's not the man some of you think he is. He spent his whole life trying to do the right thing, and now he needs us to do the same." Her words were met with a mix of applause and skepticism, but they planted seeds of doubt in the minds of those who had been quick to judge. Elijah's suspension dragged on as the internal investigation continued. His union-appointed attorney assured him that the security footage was a strong piece of evidence, but Elijah wasn't convinced it would be enough. During one meeting, the attorney laid out their strategy. "We'll push for an expedited review of the footage. Once it's cleared, you'll be back on duty in no time." Elijah frowned. "And what about my reputation? What about the people who still think I'm a criminal?" The attorney hesitated. "That's harder to fix. But proving your innocence is the first step." The words offered little comfort. One evening, a knock at Elijah's door startled him. Standing on the porch was Mr. Bennett, the convenience store owner who had provided the footage. "I've been thinking about what happened," Bennett began, shifting awkwardly. "And I need to do more." Elijah invited him in, and Bennett explained his plan to organize a small rally in support of Elijah. "You've been good to this community," he said. "It's time we show you the same." The rally, though modest, brought together neighbors who shared their experiences with Elijah. Some spoke of his kindness, while others expressed regret for jumping to conclusions. Maggie Tillman's condition improved, and she finally agreed to make a public statement. Sitting in her hospital bed, surrounded by reporters, she recounted what little she remembered of that night. "That man didn't hurt me," she said firmly. "He was trying to help. I don't know why anyone would think otherwise." Her words, though simple, carried immense weight. News outlets broadcast her statement widely, shifting the narrative even further. Elijah watched the coverage from his living room, tears brimming in his eyes. For the first time in weeks, he felt a flicker of hope. With Maggie's statement and the security footage supporting his account, the department officially cleared Elijah of wrongdoing. He received a call from Captain Monroe. "You're reinstated," Monroe said. "Effective immediately." Elijah nodded, his voice calm but firm. "Thank you. But we need to talk about what happens next." Monroe sighed. I know. We need to rebuild trust not just for you, but for the department as a whole. Elijah returned to work, but the experience had changed him. He was no longer content to simply do his job. He wanted to make a real difference. Elijah Carter's reinstatement was bittersweet. Returning to the precinct, he felt the weight of the past weeks lingering in every glance and whispered conversation. His colleagues, once friendly and supportive, now seemed unsure how to approach him. As he walked to his desk, Officer Daniel Chavez, his longtime partner, gave him a hesitant nod. "Good to see you back, man." "Thanks," Elijah replied, forcing a small smile. But the usual camaraderie was absent. Some officers avoided eye contact, while others offered clipped greetings. The atmosphere was colder than he'd expected. Later that day, Captain Monroe called Elijah into his office. "I know things feel tense right now," Monroe said, his tone unusually somber. "People are still processing everything." "Processing what?" Elijah asked, his voice sharp. "I was cleared. The footage proved I didn't do anything wrong." Monroe sighed. "It's not about what's right or wrong. It's about perception. And unfortunately, perception takes time to change." Elijah left the office feeling disillusioned. He had hoped for a fresh start, but it was clear the road ahead would be anything but smooth. Meanwhile, Maggie Tillman's life was taking a turn for the better. Encouraged by the support she had received after her statement, she began attending recovery meetings at a local shelter. At one meeting, Maggie shared her story with a group of women, her voice trembling but determined. "I thought I didn't matter," she said, "but someone cared enough to help me. That's what got me here today." Her words resonated, inspiring others to open up about their struggles. The shelter director, a kind woman named Cheryl, approached Maggie afterward. "You have a gift," Cheryl said. "Have you thought about speaking publicly? Your story could help a lot of people." The idea frightened Maggie, but the seed was planted. Despite Maggie's statement and the security footage exonerating Elijah, public opinion remained divided. Some people rallied behind him, using hashtags like Justice for Elijah to show their support. Others, however, clung to their skepticism. Online forums buzzed with conspiracy theories about doctored footage and cover-ups. "He's a cop, they're protecting him," one commenter wrote. "Doesn't matter what the footage shows. He shouldn't have touched her," another added. The negativity wore on Elijah. No matter how much evidence came to light, it seemed some people would never believe him. Latoya, ever the fighter, tried to combat the misinformation. She spent hours online, engaging with commenters and sharing facts about the case. But the constant pushback took a toll. "I feel like I'm screaming into a void," she admitted one night, slumping onto the couch beside Elijah. "You can't change everyone's mind," Elijah said quietly. "But maybe we don't have to. Maybe it's enough to reach the ones who are willing to listen." One evening, Elijah was dispatched to a domestic dispute in a middle-class neighborhood. When he arrived, the woman involved in the altercation hesitated to let him in. "Aren't you that cop from the news?" she asked, her eyes narrowing. "Yes," Elijah replied calmly. "But I'm here to help." She folded her arms, her distrust evident. "I'm not sure I want your help." The words stung, but Elijah kept his composure. "I understand," he said, "but my job is to make sure you're safe. If there's anything you need, I'll be here." The woman eventually allowed him inside, but the interaction left a bitter taste in Elijah's mouth. Even in his role as a protector, he was met with suspicion. The rally organized by Mr. Bennett began to gain traction. Community members who had initially doubted Elijah started showing up, sharing their own stories of how he had helped them in the past. One woman recounted how Elijah had helped her son avoid a criminal record by recommending a diversion program. Another man shared how Elijah had once paid for a motel room for a homeless family out of his own pocket. As the story spread, so did the support. Local news outlets covered the rally, casting Elijah in a new light. Watching the coverage from his living room, Elijah felt a flicker of hope. "Maybe people are starting to see the truth," he said to Latoya. "They are," she replied, her voice firm. "And we're not stopping until everyone does." Latoya threw herself into advocacy work, using Elijah's case as a springboard for larger conversations about racial bias and systemic injustice. She organized a town hall meeting, inviting community leaders, police representatives, and residents to discuss the issues head-on. The event was tense at first, with voices raised and emotions running high. But as people shared their experiences, a sense of understanding began to emerge. One elderly man stood up, his voice shaking. I've lived in this neighborhood for 50 years, and I've seen a lot of injustice. But I've also seen people like Officer Carter who actually care. We need more of that, not less. Elijah, sitting in the front row, felt a swell of gratitude. LaToya's efforts were making a difference, even if the progress was slow. At a subsequent town hall, a man in the audience stood up and accused Elijah directly. How do we know you didn't do something before the cameras started rolling? He asked, his tone confrontational. Elijah stood, his heart pounding. He met the man's gaze and replied calmly, You don't. All you have is my word and the evidence. But ask yourself this, what would you have done if you saw someone lying on the ground? Helpless? Would you have walked away? The room fell silent. The man sat down, and a murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. Encouraged by Cheryl, Maggie agreed to speak at a community event. Standing at the podium, her hands trembling, she looked out at the audience. I'm not proud of the life I've lived, she began, but I'm proud to be here today. Officer Carter didn't just save my life, he gave me a chance to start over. Her words were met with thunderous applause, and Elijah, sitting in the front row, felt a wave of emotion. Maggie's bravery was a reminder of why he had fought so hard to clear his name. Elijah sat on his apartment balcony one evening, staring at the city skyline. The chatter of distant traffic and the occasional hum of voices drifted up from the streets below. Yet, despite the signs of life around him, he felt isolated. His phone buzzed on the table beside him. Another message, this one from an old friend he hadn't heard from in years. I saw the news. I'm sorry you had to go through that. Hang in there, man. Elijah sighed, setting the phone down without replying. Messages like that, while kind, only reminded him of the ordeal that had come to define his life. LaToya stepped onto the balcony, 2 mugs of tea in hand. You've been quiet all day, she said, handing him a mug. Elijah took a sip, the warmth momentarily soothing. Just trying to figure out how to move forward, he admitted. You already are, LaToya said firmly. Every time you get out there, every time you show people who you really are, you're moving forward. Elijah nodded, but remained silent. The journey felt endless. The next day at the precinct, Elijah arrived early, hoping to avoid the usual stares and whispered conversations. As he sat at his desk, reviewing the day's assignments, a familiar voice broke the silence. Morning, Carter. Elijah looked up to see Officer Chavez standing by his desk, holding 2 cups of coffee. I thought you might need a pick-me-up, Chavez said, setting 1 cup down. Elijah smiled faintly. Thanks, man. Chavez hesitated, then added, Look, I know things have been weird around here, but for what it's worth, I'm glad you're back. The gesture, small but sincere, eased some of the tension Elijah had been carrying. Maggie Tillman threw herself into recovery with a newfound purpose. She attended every meeting, worked closely with her counselor, and began mentoring others at the shelter. One afternoon, as she was tidying the common room, Cheryl approached her with a smile. You're doing great, Maggie. I can see how much the others look up to you. Maggie blushed, brushing a stray strand of hair from her face. I'm just trying to give back. If it wasn't for Elijah, I don't know where I'd be. Cheryl nodded. You're turning your life around. That's what matters. Later that evening, Maggie sat at a small desk in her room, writing a letter to Elijah. She poured her gratitude into every word, hoping it would convey the depth of her appreciation. While public support for Elijah grew, so did the backlash from his detractors. One evening, as he walked to his car after a shift, a man approached him in the parking lot. You're the guy from the alley, right? The man said, his tone accusatory. Elijah kept his composure. Yes. Can I help you? The man stepped closer, his expression dark. You think you're some kind of hero? Saving people like that woman? You're just another cop who got caught. Elijah's jaw tightened, but he refused to engage. Have a good night, he said, walking past the man. The encounter left him shaken, a stark reminder that not everyone was ready to believe the truth. The rally organized by Mr. Bennett continued to grow, drawing attention from local media and activists. Elijah reluctantly agreed to attend, though he wasn't sure how he felt about being the center of attention. When he arrived, he was greeted with applause and warm smiles. People approached him, sharing their gratitude and stories of how his actions had inspired them. A young woman stepped forward, holding a handmade sign that read, "Thank you for caring." "My grandma lives in that neighborhood," she said, her voice trembling. "She's told me about how you always looked out for everyone. We need more people like you." Elijah's eyes misted over. For the first time in weeks, he felt a sense of belonging. LaToya's town hall meetings gained momentum, becoming a platform for dialogue and healing. At one event, a local pastor stood up to speak. "We all have biases," he said, his voice steady, "but we also have the power to overcome them." Elijah Carter's story is a lesson for all of us to see people for who they are, not who we assume them to be. LaToya, sitting in the front row, nodded in agreement. She had fought tirelessly to amplify her brother's story, and moments like this made her efforts feel worthwhile. After Maggie's first public speech, she approached Elijah with a nervous smile. "I never thought I'd be standing up in front of people, talking like that," she admitted. "You were amazing," Elijah said sincerely. Over the next few weeks, Maggie and Elijah developed an unlikely friendship. They often met at the shelter, where Maggie shared stories of her past, and Elijah listened without judgment. "You know," Maggie said one day, "people like me don't get second chances very often. You gave me mine. I'll never forget that." Elijah shook his head. "You gave yourself that chance, Maggie. I just did what anyone should have done." Encouraged by the progress made through LaToya's nonprofit, Elijah began advocating for changes within the police department. He met with Captain Monroe and other leaders, pushing for new policies on community engagement and implicit bias training. "We need to rebuild trust," Elijah said during one meeting. "And that starts with acknowledging our mistakes and showing people that we're here to serve them, not judge them." The proposals faced resistance at first, but Elijah's persistence paid off. The department agreed to pilot a program focusing on transparency and accountability. As the months passed, the efforts of Elijah, LaToya, and Maggie began to bear fruit. The community grew more united, with residents and officers working together to address long-standing issues. Elijah often reflected on the journey, marveling at how far they had come. But he also knew there was more work to be done. One evening, as he walked home from a meeting, he paused in front of the alley where it all began. The street lamp flickered overhead, casting long shadows. Elijah closed his eyes, taking a deep breath. This was just the beginning. The efforts of Elijah, LaToya, and Maggie began attracting national attention. News outlets highlighted their initiatives, framing them as a blueprint for rebuilding trust between law enforcement and communities. Elijah was invited to speak at a televised panel discussion alongside activists, law enforcement officials, and community leaders. The moderator turned to Elijah. "Officer Carter, your story has resonated with so many people. What lessons can we take from your experience?" Elijah took a moment before answering. "The biggest lesson is that we have to slow down. Too often, we jump to conclusions without seeking the truth." That night in the alley, people saw what they expected to see, not what was actually happening. We need to challenge those expectations. His words were met with applause, but the discussion also stirred debate. A guest on the panel questioned the effectiveness of his approach. "How do we address systemic racism without alienating law enforcement?" the guest asked. Elijah responded calmly, "By recognizing that change isn't about pointing fingers, it's about working together. We can't solve these problems alone." The conversation trended on social media, with many praising Elijah's balanced perspective. Maggie Tillman's transformation became a cornerstone of the community's recovery. With funding from a local philanthropist, she helped establish a women's shelter named Maggie's Haven. At the ribbon-cutting ceremony, Maggie spoke with quiet confidence. "This shelter isn't just about giving people a place to stay. It's about giving them hope, something I thought I'd lost forever." Elijah attended the event, standing proudly in the audience. As the ribbon was cut, Maggie caught his eye and smiled. He nodded, knowing how far she had come. The shelter quickly became a safe haven for women facing homelessness and addiction, embodying the spirit of second chances that had defined Maggie's journey. LaToya's nonprofit, Bridging Communities, gained momentum as it expanded its reach. She was invited to Washington, D.C., to discuss her work with lawmakers and advocacy groups. Standing in a conference room filled with influential figures, LaToya spoke passionately. Change starts at the local level, but it doesn't end there. We need systemic reforms that prioritize equity, accountability, and empathy. After the presentation, a senator approached her. Your brother's story and your work have inspired a lot of us. Keep pushing. We need voices like yours. LaToya returned home with renewed energy, determined to scale her initiatives even further. Back at the precinct, Captain Monroe called Elijah into his office. Monroe had been distant since reinstating Elijah, but his demeanor was different this time. I owe you an apology, Monroe said, his voice tinged with regret. When this all started, I should have done more to support you. I let the pressure from outside get to me, and I failed you. Elijah considered Monroe's words carefully. It wasn't just you, he said. The system is built to protect itself first, not the people in it. But I appreciate you saying this. Monroe extended his hand. Let's work together to change that. Elijah shook his hand, feeling a sense of closure. Elijah, LaToya, and Maggie began collaborating on new projects aimed at fostering empathy and understanding. One initiative, called the Listening Project, paired police officers with community members to share stories and experiences in a safe, moderated environment. At one session, a young officer admitted his initial biases. I used to think people in certain neighborhoods didn't want our help, he said. But hearing your stories has made me realize how wrong I was. Elijah nodded. That's what this is about, breaking down those walls and seeing each other as human beings. The program's success drew attention from neighboring cities, eager to replicate its impact. A year after the incident, LaToya's nonprofit hosted its first annual gala. The event was attended by community leaders, activists, police officers, and residents from across the city. Elijah was the keynote speaker. Standing at the podium, he scanned the room, feeling the weight of the moment. A year ago, I was just another guy walking home, he began. What happened that night could have broken me. But instead, it became a catalyst for change, not because of me alone, but because of everyone in this room. He shared stories of the people who had supported him, from Maggie's transformation to LaToya's relentless advocacy. This isn't the end of the story, he concluded. It's just the beginning. The audience erupted in applause, and Elijah felt a sense of fulfillment he hadn't experienced in months. The programs and initiatives started by Elijah, LaToya, and Maggie began to spread beyond their city. National organizations took notice, inviting them to share their strategies at conferences and workshops. One afternoon, Elijah received an email from a police department in another state. The message read, "Your story inspired us to rethink how we engage with our community. Thank you for showing us a better way." Elijah forwarded the email to LaToya with a simple note, "We're making a difference." On the anniversary of the incident, Elijah returned to the alley where it all began. The area had changed in subtle ways, a new light fixture, a mural painted by local artists depicting themes of unity and hope. Elijah placed a small bouquet of flowers at the spot where Maggie had fallen, a gesture of remembrance and gratitude. As he stood there, a young boy approached him. "You're Officer Carter, right?" Elijah smiled. "I am. My mom said you're a hero," the boy said shyly. Elijah crouched to meet the boy's gaze. "A hero is someone who helps others. You could be one too." The boy beamed, and Elijah felt a renewed sense of purpose. Elijah's story became a symbol of what could happen when people chose empathy over judgment. Maggie's Haven thrived, LaToya's nonprofit expanded nationally, and Elijah continued to bridge the gap between law enforcement and the community. During a quiet evening with LaToya, Elijah reflected on the journey. "We've come a long way," he said. "And we're just getting started," LaToya replied with a smile. As they raised their glasses in a toast, Elijah felt hopeful for the future, not just for himself, but for everyone willing to fight for change. One crisp autumn morning, Elijah visited Maggie at Maggie's Haven. The shelter was buzzing with activity, women organizing donations, staff preparing meals, and children playing in a small courtyard. Maggie sat on a bench under a sprawling oak tree, her hands wrapped around a steaming cup of tea. Elijah approached with a warm smile. "Looks like things are running smoothly." Maggie looked up, her face lighting up with recognition. "Thanks to you," she said. "If it weren't for that night." Elijah sat beside her. "Maggie, you've done this. All of it. You turned your life around. You're helping so many people." Maggie nodded, her gaze distant. "I think about that night a lot. How close I was to giving up." She looked at him, her eyes brimming with gratitude. "And how you didn't let me." They sat in comfortable silence, the leaves rustling above them. The mural in the alley where Elijah had found Maggie became a symbol of hope for the community. Designed by local artists and residents, it depicted interwoven hands of all colors, with the words, "Empathy begins here." At the unveiling ceremony, Elijah stood among the crowd, feeling a mix of pride and humility. Latoya, standing beside him, whispered, "Look what you've started." "It's what we've started," Elijah corrected, smiling. As speeches were made and the ribbon was cut, Elijah noticed familiar faces in the crowd, neighbors who had once doubted him, colleagues who had grown distant, and even some of the onlookers from that fateful night. One of the most unexpected moments came when a young man from the original crowd, the one who had accused Elijah of wrongdoing, approached him after the ceremony. "I need to say something," the man began, shifting uncomfortably. Elijah folded his arms, his expression neutral. "I'm listening." "I was wrong," the man admitted, his voice trembling. "That night I thought I knew what was happening. I didn't. I just assumed." Elijah's face softened. "What matters is what you do now. Are you willing to challenge those assumptions when you see someone else in need?" The man nodded, tears in his eyes. "I will. I promise." As Elijah's programs expanded, he began working with schools to engage young people in conversations about empathy and accountability. During a visit to a high school, he stood before a group of students in a brightly lit auditorium. "We all have moments when we judge others," he said, pacing the stage. "The question is, do you let those judgments define how you treat people, or do you choose to dig deeper?" A student raised her hand. "What if you've already judged someone unfairly? How do you fix it?" Elijah paused, his expression thoughtful. "Start by admitting you were wrong. Then make the effort to see that person for who they really are, not who you thought they were." The students nodded, their faces filled with understanding. Elijah's story was featured in a documentary about overcoming prejudice and building community trust. The film, titled In Their Shoes, included interviews with Elijah, Maggie, Latoya, and members of the community. At the premiere, Elijah sat quietly as the opening scenes played, his emotions swirling. The footage of that night in the alley brought back painful memories, but it also reminded him of how far they had come. When the credits rolled, the audience gave a standing ovation. Latoya leaned over, whispering, "This is only the beginning." Years later, Bridging Communities had chapters across the country, and Maggie's Haven had expanded to 3 locations. Elijah, now a captain, continued his work in both law enforcement and advocacy. At a fundraising gala, a young officer approached him. "Sir, I just wanted to say thank you. Your story inspired me to join the force." Elijah shook his hand, his voice steady. "Always remember, the badge is just a symbol. What matters is the heart behind it." On the 5th anniversary of the incident, Elijah and Latoya returned to the alley for a quiet moment of reflection. The mural now had a plaque beneath it, detailing the story of that night and the transformation that followed. As they stood there, a woman approached with her young daughter. "Are you Officer Carter?" she asked. Elijah nodded. "I wanted to thank you," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "Because of what you did, I found the courage to help someone in need. You've inspired more people than you know." Elijah crouched to the little girl's level. "Always be kind," he said gently. "It's the most important thing you can do." The girl smiled, and Elijah felt a profound sense of peace. Elijah sat on his balcony that evening, the city lights twinkling in the distance. Latoya joined him, handing him a cup of tea. "Do you think it was worth it?" she asked, her tone contemplative. Elijah thought for a moment before replying. "I used to wonder why it all happened, but now I see it wasn't about me. It was about all of us, and yet it was worth it." Latoya smiled, raising her mug in a toast. Here's to what's next. They clink their mugs together, the sound a quiet affirmation of hope and progress. Years after the alley incident, Bridging Communities, LaToya Carter's nonprofit, had grown into a nationwide organization. The group had become synonymous with fostering empathy and trust between law enforcement and marginalized communities. At a national summit in Chicago, LaToya stood before an audience of activists, police chiefs, and community leaders. Her presentation included success stories from cities that had implemented the organization's programs. Real change isn't top-down or bottom-up, she said. It's when both sides meet in the middle, where empathy replaces hostility and trust replaces fear. After the speech, a police chief from Baltimore approached her. "We've seen what your brother and you have done," he said. "I think it's time we bring Bridging Communities to our city." LaToya beamed. "Let's make it happen." Maggie Tillman's transformation became a beacon of hope far beyond her local community. With the success of Maggie's Haven, donors and activists approached her about taking the model international. One day, Elijah visited Maggie at the shelter, finding her in a meeting with representatives from an organization that worked in South America. "Global Maggie?" Elijah teased as he entered the room. Maggie laughed, her confidence unmistakable. "Why not? People need help everywhere, Elijah. What we started here, what you started, can go so much further." Elijah smiled, filled with pride for the woman Maggie had become. Elijah took on a new role within the police department as a mentor for recruits, focusing on community engagement and de-escalation tactics. In one of his first sessions, a nervous young recruit asked, "Officer Carter, how do you deal with people who don't trust you?" Elijah leaned against his desk, his tone thoughtful. "By earning their trust every day. It's not about one big act, it's about showing up, listening, and treating people with respect, even when it's hard." The recruits nodded, scribbling notes. Elijah's story was more than a cautionary tale. It was an inspiration for how to approach the job with integrity and humanity. One spring morning, Elijah received a letter from the White House. He was being honored with the Presidential Medal of Freedom for his work in bridging divides and fostering systemic change. At the ceremony, Elijah stood alongside LaToya and Maggie, his heart swelling with gratitude. As the president placed the medal around his neck, Elijah thought about all the people who had supported him along the way. "This isn't just for me," he said during his acceptance speech. "This is for everyone who believes that empathy can change the world." The moment was televised, inspiring countless viewers across the nation. On the 10th anniversary of the incident, Elijah returned to the alley, now a vibrant community space with gardens and murals. The plaque beneath the original mural had been updated to include the names of all the community members who had contributed to the transformation. A large crowd had gathered for the anniversary celebration. LaToya and Maggie stood by Elijah's side as he addressed the crowd. "What happened here changed my life," he said, "but it also reminded me of what's possible when we come together. This place isn't just a reminder of the past, it's a promise for the future." The crowd erupted in applause, their cheers echoing through the transformed alley. Years later, Elijah was offered the position of police chief in his city. While the opportunity was prestigious, it also came with immense responsibility. During a quiet dinner with LaToya and Maggie, he shared his concerns. "I've always been on the ground, connecting with people directly. I'm not sure I want to be behind a desk." LaToya smiled. "You can do both. This is your chance to influence change at the highest level." After much deliberation, Elijah accepted the position, vowing to continue his mission of accountability and transparency. One of Elijah's first initiatives as police chief was expanding the Listening Project, the program that paired officers with community members to foster mutual understanding. At one session, an officer shared his experience working in a predominantly minority neighborhood. "I used to think they didn't want our help," he admitted. "But listening to their stories made me realize they felt abandoned, not hostile." A resident responded, "And we used to think you didn't care. But this program is showing us that some of you do." The exchange brought tears to Elijah's eyes. Moments like these validated everything he had worked for. LaToya released a documentary chronicling the journey of her nonprofit, Elijah's Rise and Maggie's Transformation. Titled More Than a Moment, The Power of Empathy, the film premiered to critical acclaim. The closing scene featured Elijah standing in the alley saying, "This isn't about me. It's about what we can achieve when we choose to see each other as people first." The documentary was streamed worldwide, sparking conversations in communities and organizations about how to foster empathy and equity. Elijah retired from the police force after decades of service, but continued mentoring young officers and community leaders. During his final public appearance as police chief, he addressed a group of young recruits. "My career wasn't about writing tickets or making arrests," he said. "It was about building trust and showing people that we can be better together." As he stepped down, Elijah felt a sense of peace. He had laid the foundation for others to continue the work. Years later, Elijah sat on his porch, surrounded by his children and grandchildren. LaToya had retired from bridging communities, passing the reins to a new generation of leaders. Maggie's Haven continued to thrive, now operating shelters worldwide. Elijah's granddaughter climbed onto his lap, holding a copy of LaToya's documentary. "Grandpa, is this you?" she asked, pointing to a picture of Elijah standing in the alley. He smiled, his voice warm. "Yes, that's me. And that's where it all began." "Can I help people too?" she asked, her eyes wide with curiosity. Elijah hugged her tightly. "You can do anything, sweetheart. Just remember, always lead with kindness." As the sun set over the city, Elijah felt a profound sense of fulfillment. His journey had not only changed his life, but had left a legacy that would inspire generations to come. Thank you for joining this journey of hope, resilience, and transformation. If you were inspired by Elijah's story and believe in the power of empathy and unity, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. Stay tuned for more stories that spark change and touch hearts. Let's continue building a world where kindness leads the way. Turn on notifications so you never miss a story that matters. Your support helps us share more impactful content with the world.